Have in that bibliography is just the printed out version from the computer, not the printed version from the article, with a list of books that I cited in the article. But since it was a survey of sort of theoretical schools and how each of them had something to contribute to the way we look at the world, it's a pretty thorough bibliography. The only thing funny on it is why there should be an entry for Kitty Ferguson on there with a biography of Stephen Hawking, and the only reason of that is that's my wife. But I used Hawking in the article because he is famous. If you've been going to the movies lately, he's famous for the phrase that he has always been seeking the theory of everything. But in recent years, he has been saying that he does not believe that the theory of everything will ever be found. That, in fact, at the end of the day, what we're going to have to settle for is bits and pieces of a theory of everything. He calls this, and it's known in cosmological circles, the M theory. M theory. But what this really is patches together of theories that explain quite a lot about this, and a lot about this that's related to this, and something else that fills in this and this. And together, if you take them all, there are the ingredients for a theory of everything, but at the end of the day, you'll never be able to link them in such a way that they will converge into a single theory. And it's because there are gaps in our knowledge and our capacity to, they're just things we don't know. And as long as that exists, you can't patch it all together. I thought that was not a bad sort of analogy for the way I think about theory. I really believe that different theoretical schools give you a kind of highlight on different parts of reality. And that if you take a complex case, and most cases, the world being what it is, are complex, shining a different theoretical lens on this same material from the last one you just looked at or the one previously will highlight different things that are important about the whole complex. So first of all, I need to know, so I know how to do this with you this afternoon, how many of you have a good background, you would say, in IR theory? Have you done this in undergraduate or graduate work already? I mean, you're familiar with the standard schools of international relations theory. You're comfortable with what you know there, because I will do a survey for you this afternoon of some of the central sort of schools and some of their assumptions. But if you already know all of that, we can move to a different level. So how many of you would really feel extremely comfortable about that? Okay. This is, the world is sort of changing. IR theory used to be part of the undergraduate curriculum in every part of an undergraduate, say, political science degree. You didn't really get through political science and have, let us say, a specialization in international relations without having IR theory. And certainly at the graduate level, you could not do this. It's a very basic thing. It's in the old days too. You couldn't get through a political science curriculum unless you had some political theory and this was Locke and Hobbes and Marx and all of that. I frankly think that we've gone away from some of that at our peril, because I believe these old ways of looking at things resonate still today. That they have their modern versions. They're classical sort of philosophical ways of understanding what it is we're looking at and looking for. They're asking the really big questions. And unfortunately, what happens in so many undergraduate curriculums these days is specialization at an early age. I'll give you a perfect example from my own family. My son went to school. He went to Haverford in Pennsylvania. That's my second son. I told him, look, I'm happy to pay for, not happy, but I'm willing to pay for this education, but I have a few things that you have to do if I'm going to pay the bills. And one of them is you're going to have at least 2 history courses. I don't care what else you do. You're going to have at least a music course. And you're going to have an art course. And you're going to also, at the end of the day, I'd like for you to take some language. And he said, okay, Dad, I can do that. So it came to the history, right? Mm-hmm. And I sort of thought he'd be taking one of these sort of surveys of Western Civ or something like that, or maybe European history, or maybe Asian, China, or something like that. Nope. The course that he took and was allowed to take with no background whatsoever, 0, guy knows no history, like every other American kid, was a course in Chinese peasant politics between 1928 and 1939. And the theory behind his doing this is that you don't learn by these big survey courses and so on. You only learn by getting deep into a subject and wrestling with all the key unknowns about what the peasants really were like in the 30s, as opposed, the great historical arguments over what was a peasant at this time, this sort of thing. Well, I do understand that approach to learning, but at the end of the day, you've got to have some context, some sense of the spread of things in order to cope with everything that's coming at you every day. So I carry this over into IR. I work on big themes, and I use theory in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to commend it to you that way. So, no PowerPoint, just this lovely picture of Rutgers seal. I feel very proud standing up here. And what I'm going to do is talk about theory for a bit, and then maybe about 3:30, I'll switch gears. In fact, what I'm going to do is spend 5 minutes switching gears at the beginning so I can fulfill a commitment. Professor Quicot is responsible for me doing this lecture again. I come twice a year or so for about a week, and I talk about, the deal is I talk about my current research, and I meet with students, and I have a good time. I love coming I miss students terribly. But he also tells you what I should do in addition to that. And he asked me to do this again this year. And he said, I want you to do one more thing. If you know Professor Quicot, said, I want you to do one more thing. And he said, tell them how they write a master's thesis. Because some of you are master's students. How many of you are master's students? Good for you. Just starting into this. And it's important they know what a master's thesis is and so on. So tell them about that. 5 minutes on master's thesis. So before I won't run out of time or forget. I've fulfilled my requirement. It is the difference between a master's thesis and a PhD thesis. A master's thesis is a collection of existing knowledge. You pick yourself a topic. It doesn't have to be a new or original topic. And you read literally everything that has been written of any significance on that topic. You dig it all out. You will become a walking encyclopedia with regard to the topic you have picked. And in the end, the topic that you write on, you write essentially a thesis on it, or an exposition on it. It could be any subject really in the world. Obviously, it needs to be a manageable one. But remember, you need to be an expert on it. So it's the kind of thing you would do as basic work in a PhD dissertation. But the distinction between the two is that one is not original research, necessarily. The only thing original is your synthesis of that material. Once it's put together, it is somewhat original, right? It's not, but doesn't have to break new intellectual grounds. It just needs to be an interesting, compilation. Whatever, it could be really anything. PhD thesis, you're supposed to have read everything in and around the subject that you have chosen, but you're also to add new knowledge and new interpretations of something that you may have already, that a lot has already been written on, or not. It could be a relatively new subject where very few people have written. But it could be an old subject seen in a different way, or treated differently, or new material that comes to light. The other big difference is that a master's thesis is usually around 100 pages, give or take. PhD is 200, 250 pages, generally with bibliography no less than 200. And that's short, unless you're writing in a field like economics or mathematics, in which case in a PhD, even it could be, a math thesis could be 5 pages long, just formula. But our general rule of thumb is just around 100 pages for a master's thesis. I've seen some 100 pages, some 200 pages. And PhD is sort of begins at 200 pages and goes, it is a book. So you can think about the books that you read. Some are short and some are very, very long. And some dissertations are that way. The main thing is, of course, that you read everything, you take careful notes, you write it up carefully so that you're not plagiarizing, and you give proper footnotes for everything that you use. Make sure that you carefully footnote so that there won't be any issues of plagiarism. There's some wonderful tools out there that you can run your paper through to make sure if inadvertently you've plagiarized. You forgot to put the footnote in, or you've used and have not attributed. It's very hard. I run into this problem all the time with my own writings, where when I'm really using a lot of different sources, how often need I footnote? And my general rule of thumb is, if in doubt, put a footnote. And that seems to have served me pretty well so far. It's so easy, though, to rephrase in a way that you somehow inadvertently plagiarized. I mean, all decent scholars live in fear that they might have done this or left a footnote out at some stage of the game. And it's so easy with computer search engines these days to pick up phrases and things. So you have to continually worry about it. And Rutgers is beyond super sensitive about this these days, both for faculty and for students. So be very careful about what you do. And again, when in doubt, run it through the search engine, put the footnote in, and you're all right. Misconceptions. A master's thesis is not just an extended term paper. And certainly a PhD dissertation is not just a long-term paper. It's something, really a real contribution to knowledge. And it's very important that this is the case. So I have now fulfilled my obligation to Professor Clicquot, And he's in France now. I can just hear him saying thank you, and we'll proceed with theory. Now, theory. First, I have to find my miserable notes here. I said this stuff has long roots. It really does. If a lot of that political theory that we would cover in a political theory course, IR types mine and say, my theoretical school began with. And the usual lineage for Western political theory are the likes of Hobbes and Locke. And really that's not or Thucydides, some would include Thucydides. That's not too bad, actually, because one of the central features of realist theory is the sort of war of every person against everyone else. And that is straight out of Hobbes, the nature of anarchy. Thucydides also, if you read the Melian dialogues, in particular, where the Athenians basically lay it all out that, quite frankly, you do what we say or we'll kill you, and the gods aren't going to help, and nobody else is going to help, and no appeals to justice are going to help. It's very realist. Unfortunately, for the realist, Thucydides wrote other things about would sound very idealist or very liberal. So he's not dependable for the realist, but he's there. It's there in his work. Locke was a cooperative person. You remember his notion of for the common good and everybody working together. And in a sense, bad people were in the minority. You occasionally had them, but mostly people were pretty good. And if you appealed to them properly, things will come out well. And it's kind of a love your neighbor political philosophy, and cooperate with them and everybody will prosper. It's not Hobbes, where everybody is head on to everybody else. That is really a kind of liberal theory origin as well. And it was carried down in later years to people like Adam Smith and Ricardo and others who put this in the economic realm, in which the market forces were benign and good for everybody, and if everybody just didn't put up trade walls and so forth, everybody would prosper together. You know, that's pure Lockean. It's just the economic version of Lockean philosophy. So these are classic ways of thinking about the world that go way, way back, and yet today in IR theory have taken somewhat different forms. So let's start with realism. A few years ago, excuse me, I have to get rid of this, and this is as far as I go. The paradigm theorist in IR when I was in school was a gentleman by the name of Hans Morgenthau, who was a refugee from Nazism, came to this country a little bit younger than Henry Kissinger, but Henry Kissinger was a close friend of his, and the two were just like this throughout all of Kissinger's career. They used to have lunch in New York all the time, and Henry Kissinger is a classic realist. He would admit to this if he were in the room today and say he's proud of it. And I often think of Morgenthau's background as really kind of dark continental background because he escaped Nazism. He saw really the worst face of humanity. It is a very pessimistic view of the world and also people. He would say that essentially we have a world with no rules. It's anarchical. There are only states in the world in IR, and they're all pursuing their national interest, is a key term, defined in terms of power. And that morality is a fine thing for you or for me, he would say, And he always said, I personally, Hans Morgenthau, am a very moral person. But it's not for states. States have no business thinking in terms of morality. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. You do not serve the people who are your citizens well if you think in being nice terms. You have to think about being tough and pursuing your national interest. He also believed that national interest could easily be discerned, that it was a really objective thing. You just thought about the world carefully, and those national interests would come to you in a moment. No problem whatsoever. You know, Putin had an interest in getting Crimea back. And any fool could see that and anticipate that. Well, no realist did, but nonetheless, that's the sort of thinking. President Obama is supposed to sit with his advisors, and we're going to think about this afternoon what U.S. national interests are in this world, and we're going to start listing them. And then we're going to have a good bureaucratic debate about this, and at the end of it, we're going to come out with a sheet, 1 through 20, ranked, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. I'm not kidding. I have seen national security documents like this. Even worked on one once. And they are fine as far as they go. Most of the entries on there you or I could do this afternoon. If I could stop talking, we could start writing. It would be fine. And it all is a very attractive theory in a way, even though it has its ugly side, because it seems so simple. How do you do statecraft? You just figure out what the national interest is and you pursue it. And you don't worry about issues of justice or anything else. And last of all, do not allow ideology to enter into anything that you do as a statesperson. Are you promoting democracy? No, I'm not supposed to do that. Are you promoting communism or spreading your this or that? Bad. Because this clouds the real thing, which is you got your interests, I got my interests, and we're going to have to either fight it out or we're going to have to come to some agreement so that we can find some common ground, because justice doesn't enter into this. No, there are no gods. There are no real rules of humanity. This is a completely different version of the world from Professor Foucault's view, which is there is a normative universe out there into which we must fit in some way, and in which people move and have their being. I happen to be of that same school, but nonetheless, it is not Morgenthau school. Now, there are very severe problems with realism. One of them is it's a state-centered theory, and there's so many other actors in world affairs that are not states. What do you do with multinational corporations, with terrorist groups, with ethnic groups? It's nice to make it very, most of them a waste of time, like international law. And that's one problem. I think the most central problem, really, though, with realism is that whole concept of the national interest. It's easy enough to come up with a list of 20 of these things, and even to rank them if you want to argue in a bureaucratic sense about this. But the problem is defining what each of those necessarily means. Some of them are easier to define than others. Much harder than defining is the problem of balancing one against the other, because often you have to choose which priority you're going to pursue. China, for example, in the South China Sea. Is China more interested in having those bits of property out there that might have large exclusive economic zones around them and potential for bases? Well, sure. Is China worried about getting engaged in military conflict at this stage? I can't answer that question. How worried are they about how they might fare in the event of some sort of confrontation? Are they worried about their image? Because China's rating of soft power goes down whenever a battleship or the equivalent shows up by one of those islands and starts rattling its guns. The United States, in responding, how is this whole thing perceived? Where are our interests in this? In avoiding conflict, in continued trade with China, in good relations with China? How do we balance that off with being firm over those islands? These are the hard choices that anybody reaches. Merkel, am I going to sanction Putin at the price of my industry's exports suffering? Both of those, promoting exports and getting along with Russia and doing something about Ukraine, are all German interests. I'm sure they'd be on anybody's list. How do you balance this out in terms of real policy? So in the end, you've got all these interests, but it is not clear which ones will prevail in policy making. Ergo, they don't explain very much at the end of the day. And this is a problem for realists. The other major problem is this thing I alluded to a moment ago, the absence of any morality or any notion of ideology and so forth in this calculation. Most people in the world have senses of their own moral standards and of the ideological niches into which they fit. Policies are all carry moral implications, and they stir people's passions. This is what people get excited about. It's these kinds of questions, which is why so often statesmen or stateswomen, statespersons, we'll use that, statespersons, will phrase their policies and their public statements in moralistic terms. It is America stands for this. Americans must always this. Putin, Mother Russia, the greater Russia, the Russian culture and religion and so on. And all of this is mixed up in some sort of voodoo package, isn't it, to sell. But look at the arguments. Listen to these people speak. It is very rarely, well, it's in my national interest to do this, so I'm going to do it. The real realists in foreign policy are the ones who still speak like realists. Listen to Putin when he's not talking about greater Russia and some of this stuff. It's Russian interests. Anytime you see the term national interest, it is realist language. And they suspect that it is. The Chinese are very good at realist language as well. We have our core interests that we cannot compromise. It's realist language. Okay. We'll look next at liberal theorists. Liberal theorists' view of the world is much more rosy than realists. It is the notion that cooperation is extremely important in human affairs, and that most of the good things that all of us want can be had if only we find ways of making this a more peaceful and cooperative and all going together towards various goals kind of work. There's much evidence that this is so. Trade agreements, however, the beneficiaries thereof, not everybody benefits in the same way, except all the arguments. Nonetheless, you probably wouldn't want to not have them at one stage of the game, or to give up the ones that we do have. The whole global economy is built on sort of market principles, which are obviously, again, the benefits of that, ill-distributed sometimes. But nonetheless, it's there, and without it, the alternative would not be so good. Liberal theorists emphasize this. They emphasize international institutions, and there's a different variation of liberal theory, liberal internationalists, or international institutionalists. There's a lot of this at Princeton. Princeton is the hotbed of liberal institutionalists that work down there on international political economy issues. And they emphasize the importance of institutionalizing some of these things. Trade being, for example, in the WTO, and the dynamics of that organization as it actually works. I think it's one of the most fascinating organizations in the whole world. It's just fascinating. Very complicated and very interesting what goes on there. And not what you might think if you don't know the WTO. But the liberal phrase, institutions matter, rules matter. People meeting together and talking to one another, negotiating issues in committee rooms is important. And that's the liberal view in a nutshell. Constructivism, or constructivists. I saw a foreign policy survey the other day. This is the magazine, Foreign Policy, in which they ranked the most important IR theorists of the last 50 years in the order of number 1, number 2, number 3. In the past, maybe 10 years ago, had they done that, Morgenthau, except he might not have made the 50-year cutoff, would have been at the top, without question. Bob Cohane, who's a liberal institutionalist, would have been right up there. No, it's Alex Wendt. Alex Wendt is a constructivist. I think he's also a realist, but nonetheless, he's a closet realist. But nonetheless, and I'll try to explain why in a minute, but he's number 1. And he's certainly, in America, the popularizer of IR theory. Contrast him with Morgenthau. Morgenthau says everything is anarchic in the international system. There's no higher authority than the state. Wendt's most famous phrase is, anarchy is what states make of it. Now, think about that. That means anarchy, the nature of not having any of higher authority than the state, is what states agree the world should be like, and make it so. It's a completely different kind of approach. Now, it's also extremely vague, because you don't know how these sort of mental calculations are going to come out. There are actually 2 schools of constructivism, at least. And the real hair splitters could add a lot more. Wendt, I think, is a much more conservative constructivist than, let us say, people like Fritz Kratochvil, or, well, I could go down the list. Really, the names aren't that important this afternoon, and they're on your list. And the difference, really, Wendt's emphasis is on states. He's not much interested in actors other than states. In this way, he's very like Morgenthau. Now he'll say that's not necessarily true, but when you read his writings, it seems very clear to me. His emphasis is on states and what they do, and how they construct the world. Kratochvil and others who write on institutions and rules emphasize, very much like the liberals do, the effect that rules have on the way people think. John Ruggie, for example, who is another constructivist, once wrote a great deal about what he thought the importance of the concept of sovereignty was. He said, actually, at the end of the day, states are not really sovereign in any sort of concrete sense. They're forced to do things by the global system, they're buffeted about like anybody else. They don't have free choice in the world. They can't just make the world they want. But sovereignty is a kind of norm that you could trot out. It's one of the few things, for example, poor Ukraine has right now. It's a sovereign state. And trying to absorb the Ukraine is far different from what would be if this were not sovereign state territory. As has often been said, Putin's re-annexation, shall we put it, of Crimea was the first change of sovereign borders in Europe, and possibly we could extend this even further, since World War II, that was accomplished by force. There have been changes of borders, but not by the use of force since the end of World War II. So it is breaking an established rule as well as law, and the fact that it is a sovereign border and not just some other kind of border makes it much more serious. It undermines a fundamental principle that we thought would not be challenged in that way. In fact, I've written, and my co-author and I have often written, that sovereign borders didn't matter anymore because you didn't need to conquer territory. Really, in a globalized world, you simply dominated countries in other ways. You want Ukraine? Well, you don't need to take Ukraine. You just dominate it in various ways. The Russians have been pretty good at this over the years. Why march in? Why do you need to march in? Why don't you just control the place? And you could do that in other ways. In a globalized world, you can cross sovereign borders, and nobody is truly sovereign in the sense of having absolute control of everything within their sovereign borders, not even the United States or some other major power. We're all, our freedom of action is all hemmed in on many sides, but being sovereign still means something. So this is really what the constructivists mean about rules and institutions, and liberals do too. I always offer Wendt's favorite example, which happens to be my favorite example, of the constructivist way of looking at the world at work. His famous one is the Emperor Montezuma. Montezuma, you remember, was, or maybe you don't know enough history, but that's all right. He was the Aztec emperor, and the Spanish troops appeared down on the seacoast, landed. Here were these folks on horses, in armor. He got reports, and his first view of what the Spanish was that these were gods. And indeed there were legends in Aztec mythology of the return of Quetzalcoatl and other gods at some point. And his first assumption was, it's happening, they're coming back. And it delayed him just long enough not to respond in time to this. Now, Wendt would say, you will never, ever understand his decision not to act more quickly in this case, unless you realize that his view of the world included the notion of the gods coming back and what they might look like. There were some indications of what they might look like. Look rather like the Spanish. Unless you know that, he looks like a fool. But in the context, you could have predicted that, perhaps. But that didn't change the nature of the world. At the end of the day, these were Spanish, and they were after him and everything he had. And So on the one hand, there is our view of what the world is actually like. And for Wendt, it's what states think that's most important. And then there is the actual world, which does exist, even though we will never be able to know it entirely. We're all filtering the world through our lenses, both mental and other lenses, in ways that make us so biased that it's difficult for us to sometimes get an objective view, even if we want one. But nevertheless, the world is as we see it until we find out it is different. And in foreign policy, this is happening all the time. So when you, I'll give you some examples of how these are applied in a minute, and when we get back to the different, over the different fields. Postmodernism. If you've studied any literature at all, you know that postmodern analysis has been with us for a very long time. And in fact, IR theory got it through European literary critics and writers on criticism like Jacques Derrida and others. It came from France, really, postmodernism. I think some would argue that, but I think it is true. Postmodernists emphasize problems with language, the words we use, and the fuzziness of language. If you're truly working on a PhD dissertation and you're trying to find a good title and so forth, you're going to find how difficult, or a master's thesis, anything. If you're trying to write, you have to find the right word. It's very important that you do. And it means it's hard to do this. I mean, I just finished a little paper for International Studies Association, something unusual for me or something I haven't done in many years. It's called War and Political Evolution in Ancient Mesopotamia. It was really just for fun. I just wanted to read about ancient Mesopotamia, so I wrote the paper. Actually, and the ancient Mediterranean. I can't even remember my own title. Look at the postmodernists would say. Interesting title. What do you mean by war? What do you mean by war? How big does it have to be before it's war? If some Neolithic person goes with an arrow, bangs of or mace, bangs somebody over this war, how do you define war? Actually, a good empirical theorist would ask you that too. But a postmodernist would alert you to this problem. What do you mean by political evolution, for goodness sakes? What kind of polities are you looking at? What do you mean by evolving? It's a fuzzy term. What, in fact, do you mean by ancient? How far back are you willing to go? Does this include the Neolithic period? When does it begin and when does it end? When does it stop being ancient and being something else? What, in fact, do you mean by the Mediterranean? Yes, there is a sea there, but how far back from the shore and in which parts are you willing to go? And these are perfectly fair questions, which I had to really effectively, I think, answer in the paper for this paper. But a postmodernist is very conscious and always going at you, as really a good empirical theorist when you're trying to operationalize something would be, to get your terms right. And for postmodernists, we never understand one another. At the end of the day, I have a concept of war that suits me, but it will not suit them. They will argue that it's essentially meaningless because everybody will come at my paper with different preconceptions of what it is I'm reading about, and so it's all nonsense, isn't it? There is a kind of destructive quality often, I think, about postmodern analysis. But the part of it I like best are people like James Stradarian. You see several of his books there, who's my favorite postmodernist. And what he does a lot of is media studies. his famous book was looking at the first Gulf War. You remember that one, a long time ago? The Papa Bush. And he looked at how we knew what was happening in the Gulf War. All we knew in those days, most of you are too young to remember that, was what we saw on television in the evening. Reporters were embedded with the U.S. troops who went into this conflict. And they were only allowed a certain amount of leeway to film and report. And in the evening, you saw these little bit of snippets, you know, boom, and this kind of thing. And he said it was a media event. At the end of the day, how do we know there was even a war in the Gulf over there, except for the returnees and others? I mean, all we know is what we saw. And that was spun for us in a particular way. And if you don't realize that most people do see the world through their sort of media sources, I can't resist the Fox News world view, you know. They're people who think this is objective reality. So this is really a kind of postmodern thing as well, and also constructives. As you can see already, they're generally overlaps here. Let me see if there's anything else before we've gone through the schools mainly here, and I just want to be sure I'm not leaving anything else. All right, I do have a couple more. One is the kind of theory that I do. There are actually three areas I really ought to talk about. Globalization theory. This looks at the world as a globalizing world, as a transnational world. What are the trends across these sovereign borders? Transnational relations, the spread of people, of disease, of global problems. I think in a way the focus is on looking at the world as a global entity and the problems that exist really for the world as a whole. And the governance part of it moves over into the kind of liberal international institutions theory area. Some of the big names in this field are people like James Rosenau, who's died sadly a couple of years ago, and coming from sociology but also from geography, Saskia Sassen, who does fantastic work on global spaces and flows, and her classical sort of view of the way the global embeds itself in the local, and the local affects the nature of the global. She's really good on spaces and flows, and although it all has it's very difficult to pin this down in many ways. This is the way I see the world, as continual piecing together, like migration patterns overlapping with disease and the like. And it becomes so complicated it's almost incomprehensible, which is the main problem with Saskia Sassen and with my work. Sometimes you wonder, so what? At the end of the day, you're describing patterns. Where do we go from here? But it's a focus on globalization. Then there is normative theory and critical theory. And this is where I wish Professor Clicquot were here, because he could tell you about normative theory. He's doing it from the law side. Normative theorists tend to try to discern what global or international norms are at any given time. We thought we had a rule that a normative consensus, that you don't change sovereign borders by the use of force, that we have gotten beyond that. Merkel asked Putin, do you remember reading that? He asked Putin, what century do you think you're living in? Merkel is living in my book, you know, globalization. I mean, that's where she's in, and regionalization and kind of liberal global economy. Putin's living in a different book. He's in the realist book. And the old-fashioned nationalist book, it's a different kind of world. So I was shocked by what he did. A realist would probably be less shocked. So normative theorists try to discern what the going rules are globally, what is considered proper and just. And there's a lot of emphasis on what few documents we have. For example, there is very little really in the human rights area that we actually can work from in terms of documents, but there are some. And they're continually hauled out and used in one way or another as justification, and I'm glad, for actions. And much debate in human rights circles about what the real meaning of human rights is and how far the concept goes. For example, where does the right of women to wear headscarves and behave like Muslim women, conservative Muslim women, end, and human rights begin, where you have to liberate women so they don't have to do this in certain societies. There are contests of norms and perspectives and cultures here that make human rights a very complicated area. Not to mention economic rights. You know, how much right do you have to have the same sort of living standards that somebody else has? It's hard to grasp. And social societies tend to see this very differently from capitalist societies, that where everything goes and you get what you get. So that's one sort of normative theory, and usually normative theorists end their articles or their books by saying how they think the world should be. Here's the progress we've made in human rights in defining this. And then at the end they say we need to go further in doing this and this and this. And sometimes they're practical suggestions. There ought to be a world conference on X or Y, and we ought to focus more on this. Now, that's one sort of view of normative theory. And I think probably the principal view. There are other sorts of versions. I don't want to go on forever here, so I want to be sure that I cover what I want to cover and not everything else. Yes, critical theorists. I didn't want to leave them out. Critical theorists are mostly Marxists. Not all of them, but they're neo-Marxist European theorists. And they set out with a different normative agenda, which is to expose the sort of underlying, mainly capitalist and great power assumptions behind much that is happening in world affairs. They are very suspicious of so-called humanitarian gestures, for example, or interventions. They're after oil or something. You know, they're very cynical, and it's all about capitalism. It's all about American hegemony, or the hegemony of European states. It's all about the abuse of non-Western people, and there are various divisions of this. There is post-colonial theory, which I have a lot of respect when it's done very, very well. And critical thinking theory, when it's done very, very well, I respect as well. But there is a kind of paranoia in critical thinkers. Everything that they look at has got an underside that's like what happens when you pick up a rock. If you look deeply, there are motives you don't necessarily want. That's a different kind of approach to normative theory. But it's ironic because in a way critical theorists end up being as rigid about state sovereignty as the realists. They're very opposed to any form of liberal interventionism. If there is a UN force that goes, or a NATO coalition that goes into Somalia for food relief, the critical theorists will say, at the end of the day, before you even go in, we will predict this will end up worse than before, because liberal interventionism is always twisted in a way that benefits capitalism in the interest of the West, and it may look good on paper, but it's always lousy. So at the end of the day, you might as well not do it. So if you raise a question as to whether you should send a few troops to break a blockade somewhere that's keeping humanitarian supplies from reaching starving people in a province, the critical theorist would say, without even thinking of the details, no. On principle, from what we know about past interventions, no. And you can certainly see there is some evidence for their position. But they are a very sour bunch, in my opinion. I was the discussant on a panel at the International Studies Association meeting, I guess, or maybe it was a British meeting. But I had to discuss the papers of all these liberal interventionists. And at the end of the day, I said, let me get it now. If there's a desperate situation, you wouldn't intervene, and so on. Let's see, you don't like capitalism, you don't like liberal interventions. Where's the positive side of your equation? What would you do that you wouldn't be paranoid about? And they really, one thing about them, they're really honest people, and all these folks are very nice people. And they sort of scratched their head and said, oh, we have to think about that. Is there anything we could do that wouldn't be bad? And that was sort of the end of that discussion. It was kind of fun. And I have to say, the chair of the panel phoned me up, said she was writing an introduction to the book that they were producing out of the papers from this. And she wondered if I would go over my objections to their views once again, because she thought they were very helpful in reacting against in her introduction, which I thought was a contribution. She was very nice about it. Okay, let us see here. I think we just about feminist theory. Feminist theory is it's a theory. It's a theoretical school really unto itself. It comes out of constructivism and also some postmodernism. Many feminist theorists are postmodernists in their sort of view of the world. Some are critical theorists. But I would suggest that for categorizing it in your own mind, there are two kinds of at least I do in my mind, two kinds of feminist theory. One kind is very straightforward. It has to do with global issues. Look around the world, look at what's good about the world, what's bad about the world, what the problems and things in the world, and think about how much of this is gender. How are women's problems, put it bluntly, different from those of men? How are women's attitudes on certain questions different from men? If you do public opinion surveys about foreign policy issues, to what extent do women's views differ from men? And in the end, what is the significance of this? What does it suggest about what priorities ought to be in public policy and the way we think about the world? And all of that has produced some wonderful literature. Really good, solid, objective, thoughtful work. Very, very good work. Then there is also, as you might expect, a very strident, very close to the other side of critical theory, which is, quite frankly, anti-male. I mean, that's really what it is. And they're perfectly straightforward about this, and proud of it. So you'll find both of those. And the second group argues very differently, that the women are entirely different from men. That, for the most part, their views of the world are completely different. They behave in different ways, and women are under subjection and need to be freed. This is the second group. The first group sort of takes all that, I think, as background, or the understanding that, of course, this is true in many cases, in many ways, in many societies. But we have to get on with it and look at the problems and what we can do about them. And I guess just because I'm a male, I like the first group better. And I think they're doing wonderful, wonderful work. Some of that literature started out rather strident, but over the years it's become much more, mainstream, and it's great. I think it's terrific. And we have a course, I believe, in our curriculum on that, taught from time to time. I guess I should have to mention Marxism. The thing is that I think most of the useful Marxism is no longer classic Marxism, whatever that was. No one could ever figure out really what Marx was saying, because Marx is always debated about what Marx really said. But his book, because he said different things on different pages of his book, if you look carefully. But it's a way of emphasizing two things: the role of capital and production in global affairs, and the question that I believe is the most important question, and I think merges into that of normative theories, the question of who wins and who loses in existing relationships, and particularly in terms of who gets what in an economic sense. And how the world could be more just than it is in terms of basically economic rewards and more social and economic equality. If you read Marx and read it in a constructive way, and you look at the work of some neo-Marxist theories these days, that's really what it's all about. And it seems to me a perfectly fair question. Human rights are not just questions of political freedom, where Marxists are always a little bit, most of the time, a little shaky. They're not so sure it's a good thing. But a question of fairness and justice and distribution of income and all these things, that's a perfectly fair thing. So Marxists are more useful under the economic charter of the UN than they would be on the human rights side, in my opinion. Now, I just need to pull these things together, and I think we ought to talk about some of these things in your own work, and however way you feel free to get up, stretch, whatever. But I do want to say this. I don't believe that you need to choose between these different perspectives. This is something that I believe that is, however, very controversial in IR theory circles. What I'm saying today might be contradicted by some of the self-same theorists that I've been saying I think so much of. Because there is a kind of an assumption, particularly in some circles, that once you move from one lens viewing the world to another, you begin to blur the perspectives, and it's better to write a thesis, let us say, or a dissertation from a realist perspective, putting this right up front and say, here's how my case looks from a realist perspective. And once you start moving away from that, you begin to confuse the situation. You muddy the waters. I understand that perception. I think it's just pure intellectual laziness and approaching dishonesty. Yes, the world is complicated, so I'm going to simplify it so it's not real in any way anymore, but you're going to have to accept my view of it. I just don't see why that should be the case. Just take a couple of cases. Let me do the Ukraine case. I actually just talked on this subject in Poland a little while ago, a few months ago. That was an interesting experience. From a realist perspective, you can see how a realist would cut this. What is in Russia's national interest? What is in the national interest of the Ukrainians? Putin, I do not believe anyone would suggest, is deeply into morality in the usual sense of things, or if his morality is, it's not of the sweetness variety. I don't. Maybe somewhere he says to himself when he gets in a room and looks in the mirror, this is right, this is justice, what we're doing here. And he thinks in those terms, and he uses this in his language sometimes, but a realist would say he speaks like a classic realist. This is in Russia's interests, in discussion. That's it. That's it. I've said it. That's why we're doing this. It's in Russia's interest. And, you know, stop me if you can. The realist dimension of that is easy. The liberal dimension is a little harder to see. This happens, and it disrupts liberal relationships in which Putin and Russia are deeply embedded already. He's in the WTO. He's in the international banking system. He's dependent on world trade. He's dependent on the oil market. There's a host of things that are part of that liberal cooperative world that he has sort of backed out of and has come back to, in turn, to bite him and the economy. So I think the liberal stuff is relevant here. And one of the liberal institutions, of course, involved in this whole business is the EU and the EU policy making and the way people have or have not, mostly in my opinion, have not responded to this crisis very effectively. And constructivists have a field day here. What do you think Putin is doing? You know, what are his objectives? At the end of the day, is this really about his views of what he needs to do to keep in power domestically and to keep his agenda on track? Is it just stirring a little something abroad so that his popularity goes up, which seems to work pretty well so far? Or is he really thinking in terms of greater Russia, Russia's destiny, Russia's past and future? Is there a kind of construct here of that he has in mind, and what does it really look like? Outside of that, what do European decision makers or U.S. decision makers think is Putin's view? When Obama looks over there, you know, what does he think? What is Putin up to? This is pure constructivism. How far will he go? What will he do if we do this? Or do this? Or don't do this? What will others think if we don't do this? Will we lose our credibility? This is pure constructivism land. No question about it. Normative theory. I've already talked about the erasing of sovereign borders by force, breaking of usual rules. And I'll go back to Merkel's phrase, what century do you think you're in? You know, you're behaving like something from a different age. We don't do things like this in this way anymore. We just don't blatantly send forces in that fashion and then deny that we did it. send them in with their insignias stripped off and say, these are not Russians. And 5 weeks later, we're giving them medals, back in Moscow. It's pure cynicism at one level. Absolute junk. Well, it's a normative shock. It's in the realm of normative theory. And postmodernists could have a day with the language that is being used to describe what has happened and what is prevailing currently. I believe that if you take any issue, I would invite you to do this, really. Take any issue in which you are interested and view it from a realist perspective, a liberal point of view, if you feel it's relevant to this case, or if you read more of the critical theorists, you have to read them to really get what they're about. Being more critical in the ways that they are, being more cynical about motives. I've seen some of the stuff on, the critical theorists can't stand Putin, although they are neo-Marxists, and they certainly can't stand the West. So they just see bad things all over the place. There's nobody worse. Here's just a bunch of bad folks getting together and doing bad things as usual. It's kind of their sour approach to that one. Any of those perspectives. The only thing I have not talked about, just have 1 minute on this. You have to make a distinction at all times, and maybe I should have started this, between theory and methodology. It's very important. You can pursue any of these approaches with different methodologies. You can be as scientifically rigorous as you want to be in any of these realms, as long as you're quite clear about what it is you are doing. A true scientist or empiricist in social science would say we can ask a question, define our terms, and investigate it in a data gathering way, and in the end our outcome will be as objective as we can make it. The better we've defined our terms, the more data we've had, the more honestly we have looked at it, the more convincing our conclusions will be. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's certainly nothing wrong with data or all the various ways of manipulating it and using it, and I encourage you to do this. I have done quantitative work actually a long time ago in my youth, but I did enough of it to know its utility and also its limitations. So it has really nothing to do with these other schools. You can do a realist paper using quantitative data. And I might say that you should try what you can. I always believe one of the questions you should ask in any exercise that you do is whether there might be data out there that you could actually, things you could quantify, and ways in which you could use that data and add at least a little more precision to some of the things that you're discussing. It's not all anecdotal or analytical or what I think, or you do it in a systematic way. And no matter what you're doing, the more systematic it is, the better. Be very precise when you switch theoretical schools and let the reader know you're now going to look at it from this perspective. Don't just fuzz it over. Make it clear so that people know it when you switch the lens. But there is this distinction. I will also say that behind every so-called empirical study, even those that would argue they're nothing but science done using the scientific method, lies a theoretical perspective. They may not be conscious of it, but it's there, and they should know that it lies there. The very subjects you choose to study reflect a theoretical orientation on your part. This is it's a mindset, a way you view the world, as to what is important or interesting is immediately a theoretical statement when you choose a topic. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is this important? And how shall I then view it? The data that you gather will often be gathered because of your theory. I'll end with this. Debbie and I were talking earlier about the Correlates of War project, which is one of the best data gathering projects in the history of American social science. It was a group of quantitatively oriented social scientists who decided they could understand war much better than anybody else if they could gather enough statistics on war. And again, they were very careful to define what they meant by war. You had to have a body count of X amount before it would be a war, and so on. It had to last a certain time, and so on. So that excluded some sorts of conflict. And they went back through history, tried to get as many facts about how many people died, how long the thing lasted, the weapons that were used, the strategies, etc., everything that they could quantify. And then they began to do correlation analysis and try to ascertain the causes of wars through this kind of manipulation. And they came up with some interesting material. And the best thing about the whole project is it still exists as a data set. You don't have to go back and do all that work again. It's sitting there. It's open to the public to use if you happen to be working on conflicts. And you can look at some of their conclusions and see how they match up today. But in a sense, my former Rutgers colleague, John Vasquez, who I think is the best war theorist there is, wrote the famous book called The War Puzzle, went through all of this Correlates of War project and all that had been written on the causes of war, and said that after 30 or 40 years of determined social science investigation and the expenditure of a lot of money and time and energy on gathering the data, we in fact know nothing more than we did at the beginning about the causes of war. And as somebody, he said, who participated in this in a very big way, I have to ask why. And he said, unfortunately, I have to say it's because the project proceeded with realist theory foundations. It only looked at states and only and looked at wars through generally a realist lens. And the kind of data that was gathered was very state-centric, dependent on states gathering the data that you then used from their sources, et cetera, et cetera. And whereas, he said, I sense that war is a much broader social phenomenon, the causes are much more fundamental and psychological and in realms where you have difficulty quantifying. We don't really have good data on this. They didn't go to psychological surveys, for example, or newspaper imaging of ethnic conflicts or things of that order, the way newspapers talked about the enemy or things of this order. It was really a very sort of sanitized version of state statistics. And in the end, very, very limited, although quite good. And he challenged us to find new ways of thinking about why wars happen. And I had to deal with this in looking at the ancient Mediterranean. Are we really hardwired as humanity to do this stuff? I mean, certainly we're capable of it. The evidence is absolutely clear. Are we hardwired to where this is something we just jump to in our solution of problems? But is it something that we go to very easily, going from just conflict to armed conflict? Or to what extent are we forced into wars by scarcity of resources
circumstances, too many people, too much pressures, fears of the other, self-defense, heading off problems, etc. Or to what extent is war just something that is not in our genes, or I think my daughter, who's a biologist, would say I'm phrasing that wrong, but it's not in ourselves, and it's not in our stars, to quote Shakespeare. It's in our culture. That once we started doing war, it became something that we just did. I actually think mostly it's the latter. And in looking at the ancient Mediterranean, I came to the conclusion that war is something they started doing and became just like eating breakfast. It became something that everybody did and was expected to do. Kings that didn't do it didn't last very long. Yes, there were resource problems. Yes, it is obvious that people were willing to kill others, sometimes very brutally, but at the end of the day, it was a matter of custom. It was culture. And the West, in a sense, this sounds like neo-colonial theory, set the standard. The Mediterranean was where the cradle of civilization. They got there long before the Chinese were organized. Their world history began much earlier in the Mediterranean than it did elsewhere in any significant way. So the very least you can say, the Western Mediterranean set a very bad example, even though the other parts of the world might have got there anyway, later. Some anthropologists would argue that is the case, for some of the same reasons. Anyhow, there's so many theoretical choices, but use those different lenses. And I'm easy to reach by email. If any of you ever want to talk to me, we can talk. I really enjoy hearing from my students, and even students who are not my students. You want to talk about something sometime in this realm. If you want to pursue a particular school of theory, I can give you a list of the best of the theorists, and maybe I should have done that instead of passed out that bibliography. But most of the names that I mentioned are on there, and those are the books you probably ought to look at. Now, why don't we do this? I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts on any theoretical sort of experiences you might have had. Any questions or otherwise you have. And we can use a little bit of this time, and we'll quit a little bit early because 2 hours is too long. Reading the literature would suggest otherwise too, I think. There's the famous one, my mind's not working this afternoon, it must be too long today. The famous one by, it wasn't Oedipus, it wasn't Aeschylus. It's the famous, yeah, it's the one where women withhold their, no, not Medea. It's the one where, well, I'll be blunt, women withhold sex from the men for a length of time to stop war. Right. It's a famous comedy. It works pretty well. It really does. It changes the equation rather significantly. It's a fun play. It's one of those that really translates well in the present time. And I'm sorry I can't quote it. But again, if you're interested, I can get it for you. But yes, there's great literature on that. A lot of the feminist theorists spend a lot of time wrestling with this question about whether women do see the world differently from men. And I read the literature, and I have to say, I think that the balance of opinion is yes, they tend, if you take women as a group, in a very large group, they do tend to. And that has some very interesting consequences, and has it at different times in different places, and has rather enormous potential, particularly as the more women, as they become, the term is not too helpful, but liberated around the world, more active in civil society and everything else, it has enormous, if this is true, that it's also been true, it's a male-dominated society for thousands of years, with very few exceptions. So if women begin to play the same sort of role that their numbers would suggest, and there really are different ways of looking at things, this could have a pretty big difference in world affairs. And actually work on this is still in its infancy, as is feminist theory. It's only been going in a big way for a few decades. You can't expect too much so far. But it's fascinating. It really is. And certainly the people like Ann Tickner and others who talked about the world as the difference in global issues between those that relate to women and those that are less directly related to women, pretty clear, pretty quick that there really is a distinction here. And it's very, very important. Well, the UN has reacted to this. You know, there is an organization now devoted entirely to problems of women, as well there should have been a long, long time ago. And it's certainly take an area of development like Africa. Think about the difference of women's problems in Africa versus men's problems. It's in that society, it's enormous. So if you're interested in development, you've got to be aware of this in some fashion, and certainly in the whole. Well, globally, it just manifests itself in different ways in different societies. But yes,
thank you for the lecture. One of the issues, like when you construct your research design, is choosing this unit of analysis issue. And then when you try to choose lenses and you try, like, from which lens you're looking at the problem, like, of course, Marxism would like say, like, look at the domestic structures, yes, and they will determine them. And then realism would, like, of course, look at the international structure. And how would you say, how big of anathema right now it would be jumping from different units of analysis in your research?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And actually, should have. It's one of the problems of moving away from one's notes. I don't think I really talked about structural analysis of a sort of neo-realist view of the world. And that's easy enough to fill in very quickly. And the famous name here is Kenneth Waltz. And other structuralists. Kenneth Waltz he argued that the basic thing to understand most of global affairs is to understand whether it's a bipolar world or a multipolar world or a unipolar world or several other models kind of in between. And what are you looking at? You're looking at states, and you're looking primarily at their power defined mainly in military terms, but also somewhat in economic terms. Some of this came from economics. Marx, because he's certainly not a Marxist. Kenneth Waltz, who another great theorist that recently died, was asked many times, well, don't you think this is an oversimplification of the world? And then somebody would bring up something that structure didn't seem to have any effect on whatsoever. And he'd say, what about this, Mr. Waltz? And Waltz would say, oh, exception. What my theory covers 99% of what you need to know. You're fishing in the 1%. I admit it doesn't explain everything. So, and that was the end of the argument. That was that. The main criticism of structural views, and I really should have mentioned it because it has its strengths, is that there's so many different kinds of structures. The world looked at from different ways has different structures, overarching structures. The oil market is a structure in and of itself. It is almost a political system in and of itself, an economic system in and of itself. There is a kind of ideological structure of the world. I could talk to you about dividing the world into a sort of democratic world. This kind of thing geographers, the really good ones, do. They say, here's the world. Well, now we're going to look at where are the democratic regimes. And then you define what you mean by democratic very carefully, that they're relatively free elections and most of the results are observed, etc. There's choices, real choices in elections and so on. And then there's a world of old-fashioned dictatorships, really old-fashioned dictatorships. And then there's a world of sort of illiberal democracies. This is very, it's becoming a much more popular category these days. And some countries like Russia slip into one category and out of one structure and into the other on the map. I would put Hungary, I would put Turkey in the illiberal democracy realm, whereas I would have put both of them in the democratic column a little while back. Now, no democracy is perfect, including the one we're sitting in or standing in right now. But I think you know what I mean. And then there are other kinds of regimes. We could go on and on. But there's those kinds of structures. There are religious structures in the world. There's a Christian world, even though the Christians are often fighting among themselves, both certainly ideologically, even in the United States. Then there is a Muslim world, and we all know all the differences these days in Islam. And there's a Buddhist world. These are all structures. Some of them are more formalized and organized and institutionalized than others, but they do exist. And they may be as relevant as states to much of the things that are happening in the world. One of the things all of us looking at global politics are so keenly aware of is the degree to which religion has come back as a very significant category. Those with a very long view would say, well, it only went away for a very brief time, if at all. It's just back again. It's moved to the fore again. Suddenly, it's a category that seems to be shaping a lot of different things, more than in the recent past. We seem to be having a more secularized world, and now it seems less secular than it did a while back. Even, to that matter, American politics. It's interesting. Even some European politics. It's very, very odd. And of course, a lot of it is changing. The papacy is not what it was some years ago. It is what it was, but it isn't. It's changed. Structures themselves change internally, so they're not the same. 1 year from the next, the oil market is not the same. Saudi Arabia does not have the clout in the structure of the oil market that it had. Still has plenty, but it's not the same. So that's one thing Waltz, by the way, would admit to and say that's all right. I'm not saying structures never change. He was often criticized for not being able to explain why structures change. His was a very static system, everybody said. Well, it's not entirely fair because there were bipolarity changed significantly over a period of years as the Cold War petered out and so on. And now we know, looking back, it really wasn't bipolar in any real way except ideologically. That in terms of power, this former Soviet Union really was a pretty small power in global affairs. Yes, they had serious nuclear weapons in the nuclear weapons field, yes, very, very significant, but they militarily grossly related because most people relied on state statistics. Even in dealing today with China, it's very difficult to assess China's power. Now just add that about realism. Power is a central concept in realism, and it is very difficult to define. Realists always had a set of power factors that contributed to the power of a state. And they're the usual things. Military power, size of the economy, how educated the population is, natural resources, all these. It's a considerable list. And in fact, it varies, which is one of the problems with the theory is, what's your list of power factors? Is they do vary from theorist to theorist. But the problem with that is that there's very often you leave off moral authority or ideological power. It was something that Morgenthau didn't want to talk about. And yet, it's like, you remember Stalin's question, how many divisions has the Pope at Yalta? Having no conception whatsoever of the significance of Catholicism in the world. Ideology is so significant in global affairs. Joseph Nye has written extensively about soft power, the importance of soft power. And this is something that, again, Morgenthau would have difficulty dealing with. The degree of soft power, and this is something that Chris is working on China. The degree to which China wants to be perceived, China is concerned with its reputation in the world or not concerned. That's really a question. How concerned are they? But what is China's hard power versus China's soft power? And you might come to very different conclusions depending upon what you're actually looking at. Yeah, sure.
If we have a couple of minutes, you didn't say anything about the four great debates in international relations. I was wondering if maybe you care to just mention
with two things. Why don't you list them, and then we'll talk about it. No, we're fine. You've raised it.
Why don't I list them? Okay. First great debate is realism versus idealism. Right? Second one would be the traditionalist approach towards behavioral approaches.
Right.
And we have inter-paradigm debate, realism, liberalism, globalism.
Yeah, maybe all these other paradigms that we talked about.
More or less.
Right, and now?
And then more modernism, postmodernism.
Postmodernism, yeah. I'll come back to that in a sec, because I didn't finish answering your question. What happens if you mix these things?
Yeah, if you mix them.
I say that I'm a very practical kind of person here. The world, according to if you're doing a PhD or a term paper, the world of the utility of theory is what your instructor thinks it is, or your supervisor thinks it is. I really believe this is true. If your supervisor says, don't mess around with a lot of theoretical views, you get yourself tied up in knots, be consistent. You've got enough problems without mixing your theory, starting with the fact you're dumb. A lot of supervisors approach the world this way. Then don't. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. Then when you go back and revise it and write your book, think about other ways of looking at it. Truthfully, I could, if I had time, which I don't at the moment, I'd love to write a paper on Ukraine viewed through different theoretical lenses. It would make a terrific paper. It's just waiting to be written out there. And in fact, no one's done it on the China Seas issue. No one's done that. And I think it'd be very, very helpful. But yes, it can be dangerous. If it becomes unwieldy, I think the way I would do it is I'd write it from maybe one theoretical perspective and say why I chose that.